This will be another important topic for many of you, and that is what the scales really measure. Many of us step on the scale and get really overwhelmed by that one number. So it's really crucial that you understand exactly what it is that is making up that number on the scale. It is influenced by a variety of factors. So let's unpack what affects scale weight, and also going to discuss some alternative metrics that can provide a more comprehensive view of your progress. So first up, the different factors that influence and make up the number that you see on the scale. And perhaps the biggest culprit and driver of fluctuations, and that is water retention. Your diet, your salt intake, hormonal changes, and even hydration levels, they will all influence how much water your body is holding on to. And that in turn influences the number that you see on the scale. So for example, after a salty meal, and we typically see this if you eat out, there's going to be more salt and seasoning in the food that you're eating than perhaps there is when you have a meal at home. That is going to encourage you to hold on to water, and you're likely to see a spike in your weight on the scales the next day. It does not mean that you have gained fat in any way, shape or form. Next up in terms of influencing the number you see on the scale, and that is muscle mass versus fat mass. Muscle is denser than fat. That means it takes up less space, but it weighs more. If you've been strength training, then what you might see happening is that you are gaining muscle whilst at the same time losing fat. And now that might mean there is little to no change on the scale. That is why focusing on scale weight can be so misleading, because the reality is you might be feeling like your clothes are fitting that much better, but the scale is reading exactly the same. The next thing to influence scale weight is food intake. This is the amount of food that is in your system at any one time, especially when you step on the scales. That's why I always say to weigh yourself first thing after you've been to the loo and with no clothes on. So effectively, there is likely to be very little in your stomach when you are jumping on the scales. But if you've jumped on the scales and you've recently eaten, then there is still going to be food in your stomach and in your intestines, which is going to show up on the scale weight. Similarly, if you had a really heavy, full, big dinner that is slow to digest, then that might show up on the scales the following morning as well. Next up, bowel movements. Now, this might seem a little bit awkward to talk about, but actually regular bowel movements or irregular bowel movements can affect scale weight. If you're feeling constipated, it could show up as additional weight on the scales. Conversely, if you've had a good bowel movement, and you all know what I mean by that, it could show up on the scales by a drop in scale weight as well. And finally, the time of day can very much influence the number that you're seeing on the scales as well. Most people weigh less using the scales in the morning than they do using the scales in the evening. That doesn't mean that they have gained X percentage of fat throughout the course of the day. That is impossible. But it does come down to things like bowel movements, how much food is in our system, etc., etc. So all of the other things that I've mentioned. So try to be consistent with the time that you jump on the scales. As I've said, first thing in the morning, after you've been to the loo, with no clothes on. Now let's explore some alternatives that you can use to help you track your progress effectively. First up, body measurements. Taking measurements of key areas of your body, so around your waist, around your hips, around your thighs, around your biceps. They can provide a great overview of the changes in your body composition. As I said before, muscle is denser, is leaner than fat, and that will show up on scales. Even if the scale isn't moving, you might see centimetres lost off those measurements. You can track and add these into the app so that you can see what the changes and the fluctuations are over time. Next up, strength gains. So keeping a track of your workout progress is hugely motivating in terms of understanding your progression. Are you lifting heavier weights or doing more reps or more sets? Increased strength often indicates Increased strength often indicates muscle gain and improvements in fitness, which are a brilliant, brilliant way of assessing your progress. You can see all of your progress in the app in relation to everything that you were logging in sessions. So you can see how those things have changed over time. It's a really motivating thing to look back on and refer to where you started versus where you are now. And I think it's quite mind-blowing sometimes when you see the progress that you've made in what is a relatively short period of time. Next up is how your clothes are fitting. Pay attention to how your clothes fit. Are they feeling looser? Are they feeling tighter? They are very much an indication, far more so than any changes on the scale, in terms of what is happening from a body composition point of view. And also, it's a little bit easier than trying to take measurements as well. So just tune into how your clothes are feeling, but also tune into how confident you're feeling in your clothes as well. And maybe you're putting things on that you haven't put on for a while. All of these things are a brilliant assessment of progress. Next up, your energy and your mood levels. So how do you feel overall? Are you feeling more positive? What are your energy levels like? What is your appetite for life like? And I've talked about strength gains, but there's also improvements in other areas of physical performance as well. So how are you performing in other physical activities that you might already do, or you might have introduced into your day-to-day or your week? So whether it's running, whether it's cycling, whether it's walking, whether it's other sports that you do, can you get a view of the improvements in endurance or speed? These things indicate that your body is becoming more efficient. It might be as simple as, I've started running for the bus. That's something I never did before. These are great indicators of how your health and fitness is improving and what your progress is looking. Ultimately, the scale and scale weight is just one piece of the puzzle, and it might not even be a piece of your particular puzzle. By understanding what influences your weight, by understanding what the improvements are more holistically in your fitness, in your health, and incorporating lots of different alternative metrics, you can develop a much better helicopter view of how you are doing. When you pull together all of these different pieces of the puzzle, they create a far more exciting world view, a far more exciting perspective of how your world is changing than just one number on a scale. And that, I think, is pretty bloody brilliant. There is a PDF that accompanies this that will outline the other measures that you can track. So have a look through just to remind yourself of what else it is that you could be doing other than just jumping on the scales. And as always, if you've got any questions, just ask.